When people use the phrase ideas man, they're talking about people like Paul Cockerton. He's a creative genius, and you may know him from being half of the duo that set up Dynamo PR. He's currently the Chief Product Officer at Clarity PR, where he's also the Managing Director of the team that looks after creative ideas for startups. But he's also famous for setting up Any Questions Answered, the SMS text service that people used to use back in the days when Alexa and Siri, etc. were just science fiction. You could text it and get an answer to any question that was on your mind at all. Today, I want to ask Paul about his creative process and, more importantly, about the application of creativity so that you can actually get something made out of creative ideas and achieve some results. Hi, Paul. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I would love to get to know what it is that goes on in your head that helps you to come up with creative ideas today. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions about this. But do you have a set creative process?
Look, I think anyone can be creative. And I think creativity is the gold that makes things run further and faster. And often it's a very simple process of taking a little bit more time to think about what you're doing and seeing if you can improve it. And perhaps not only you just looking at that problem, but involving others. I'm a big fan of creative tension, of people coming from different viewpoints, different backgrounds, really sort of going at the ideas to see if you can come up with something better. And I think it's really important when you're, because I've started a few companies, obviously run PR campaigns for some very big brands, but the process is really simple at the beginning. Is that you have an idea, how are you going to do it so that it works, and then how are you going to persuade other people to let you do it, basically.
So when you're approached by somebody, or when you've got a client that you've got to come up with a creative idea for, what is the first thing you do?
So, getting back to my point, I think everyone can be creative. I think creativity is very much a temporary phenomenon. It's very much of its time. Something that will work now may not have worked a couple of years ago. And so because of that, it's really important for everyone to be very much present in what's going on in the world, in the media, in culture, in lifestyle, even if it's like only one area of that. If you're very removed from the market that your client is looking at, it's quite difficult in abstract to try and come up with something. The second thing I think is that, when you're trying to come up with a creative idea, everyone says, it's important for it to be, original. It's not always the case. Sometimes it's quite good, to copy. I remember a long time ago, I was at a talk with Simon Woodruff, who famously founded Yo Sushi. And he came up with the idea for Yo Sushi by sitting at a dinner table, and his dining colleague said to him, "Have you seen these conveyor belt food machines in Japan?" And he said no, he was looking to do something, and when I had a look, he sent off for a manual. It came back, and not only did the manual have how to set it up, it had all the suppliers. So all he did really was copy what was going on in Japan and bring it over to the UK. So he moved the context, he moved the geography, he updated it a little bit to make it a bit rock and roll for the UK market. But essentially he was copying. Copying often is a lot faster. So I think creativity works by looking at what other people have done and trying to think, how can we do that for our market? And that is, I think, really the basis of good ideas. Now, there is a challenge there, because I don't think what you don't want to do is something that's so obvious that lots of other people have thought about it before or have done it before. Floating something down the Thames, for instance, like is a real sort of bugbear. Treasure hunt, that's another real bugbear of mine. Art installation, these are ones that just keep coming up because they're lazy. They're not really thinking about the client's product, the client's market or customers, or what they're trying to get for. And I think you need to have quite a sort of 360 awareness of all of these different spheres before you even begin to start to put down ideas onto paper.
And this awareness, I guess, is where inspiration comes from. I remember you were in a course that I was running a while ago on presentation skills, and while everybody else was, I think everyone else was looking at me, you were looking at the ceiling, and you just suddenly interrupted and said, "Why are there so many hatches in this ceiling?"
Honestly, that came from a book that I read. I can't remember who wrote it, where they said adults very rarely look up. Kids look up because of their height, but adults very rarely look up. So I often am looking up because of that little bit of advice I once read.
And that's, I think, an interesting thing, knowing how to look from other people's perspective. I think that's one of the things that you are definitely an expert in, being able to walk into your audience's side and extract what they may be thinking or feeling in order to come up with an idea. How important do you think the audience empathy process is in this?
It's really important. It's the most crucial part, because I'll give you a really good example. When we formed the company that produced Any Question Answered, and we launched it in 2004, there were three of us working on the concept. Now, I actually came up with the idea of using text message as a means to allow people to ask any question, and having researchers come up with an answer. And it was not a totally original idea. Like, there was Ask Jeeves, which was around, that allowed you to do it on the internet. But the timing was really interesting because premium text allowed you to charge for it. So there was a business model there, and you could get the same premium text code across different phones, 63336. But the real genius, I think, came from the three of us looking at this idea and thinking about the audience. And we were thinking about all the impossible questions that there's no way we could answer. What colour shirt am I wearing? What's my girlfriend's name? Where do I live? And we kept, looking at this problem. How can we get people to keep using the service? And the answer that we came up with, thinking about the people's minds, is it didn't actually matter if it was the right answer. It mattered if they thought the answer was worth £1, which is what we charged initially. So that if you said, if someone asked, what was their girlfriend's name, you don't say, I don't know, because it's worthless. But if you make up a name and do some really interesting, fact about it, that's worth £1. And I think that was the sort of genius, and the slight twist of humour and insight and intelligence that made AQA run, so far and so fast in the UK.
That's interesting. So that was when Ask Jeeves still had humans doing much the same thing. They're actually answering questions and a couple of editors getting back to people as well.
And the other interesting thing about AQA was that when we launched it, quite a few other people, because I've been in the mobile phone business for a while, because I was one of the sort of founding team of Symbian back in the 90s. And so I had a lot of connections within mobile networks and devices and services. And I probably had about 5 or 6 people who came to me after we launched AQA saying, I had that idea. I had the idea to launch a question and answer service. And sort of my response to that is, well, why didn't you do it, really? And I think that something, you referred to earlier, I think, having a creative idea is good. Executing it is the most important thing. Ideas are 2 pennies. So everyone can have very similar ideas, but it's how you execute it, how you put it into motion, how you manage the budgets, how you evolve it, how you recover from your mistakes, how you try and set out what you'll do if things go wrong. These are all the sort of the really sort of hard bits. And what you've got to try and do is you've got to try and balance the magic, with the execution. Sometimes you have to move fast, but sometimes I think you just need a bit of tension there to sort of just think about a little bit more how you can make this work really effectively.
How do you help people be more confident in their creativity when you're working with them?
I think to allow them to see what happens at the very beginning. So I've always had this philosophy that if we're having a creative brainstorm, that anyone can and should take part at all different levels, and it's quite a good melange of people, coming in, having 5 or 6 people from different levels, different backgrounds, to come up with ideas and to have a very positive environment where strict rules of brainstorms, no idea should be shouted down. You build up off off each other's. So I think having that experience of seeing, what ideas can come is super important. But the other part, I think, is that people will often downplay their creativity. They think that creativity is this huge, big thing where you come up with this incredible idea to have a gorilla playing drums, or, I don't know, take apart a Honda car and make an advert of the bits hitting each other. And sure, there are incredible creatives out there who are able to do these things, but creativity can be very simple as writing a sentence, that works, a tweet, that conveys conceptually, things on different levels. That's quite clever. And people who are great writers who are creative, people who can draw are creative, people who can think are creative, people who can write a press release can be creative. And I think it's just understanding, the levels of that and building on that. I think it's a skill. It's a skill that you can learn. Now, I do think that there are people who are more creative than others, and I often think that's because they're in one or two minds. They actually have different backgrounds. They're able to take on things. They're sort of steeped in culture. They think about different things in slightly different ways, and that dissonance works really well. And I think to create that in agencies, and the problem with some agencies is that you have a team of people who are quite like-minded. They hire people who fit in. People from very similar backgrounds. You're going to get the same ideas from everyone sitting around the room, and that's one of the reasons why, obviously for a long time I've been working on, diversity of people working, in teams of experience and thoughts. And I remember in Dynamo, we hired some really, really fascinating people. Like one guy who'd had 25 interviews, hadn't got a single job, mainly because of his accent, but he was like amazing, like his ideas. Another person who hadn't got A-levels or a university degree, but was like razor sharp in their thinking. And bringing these people up who had slightly different backgrounds and experiences allowed us to come up with some really amazing campaigns. But I do think creativity is a process that you can apply on like a day-to-day basis. Like, how am I going to get through this day? How am I going to do this work? Let's take a little bit of time to think about it and add some process around creativity, and I think it can work. So confidence comes from, I think, building blocks, building on it. Seeing someone who's very creative, understanding the creative process, maybe learning from how something that was really creative, that did really well, how that was implemented and what the impact of that was, and learning from that, so you can take elements of that to copy.
And during the last year, the pandemic year, you must have had to now collaborate with other people remotely when it comes to coming up with ideas for your clients. How have you adapted to that?
So, I mean, one thing I've learned is that before the pandemic, I was very anti-remote working. Mm-hmm. I firmly believed that people would be best served by working, together, that the magic happens, and throwaway comments, occasional conversations over the water cooler, grabbing everyone together, working very closely, and that it just simply couldn't be replicated in a remote environment. And I think the remote environment is a different environment. It doesn't, it brings actually different positive elements to the conversation. It means that the person who normally shouts the loudest is quietened a little bit. It allows people who are quieter to have a bit more of a voice, because Zoom, Google Meets, they're all great levelers for communication. And people are using Slack, obviously, to sort of communicate for those sort of throwaway comments. So what we've had to do is, and we've had a number of instances where it's been very interesting doing collaborative work and just using tools that are available to us. I think, one, to give an example, when you're doing Creative Brainstorm, you have a big white bit of paper and you start writing things down on it, and there's sort of offshoots of ideas that encircling and stars and all sorts of things. But there's exactly the same tools that you can have online. And so when it's just assigning one person to start writing the ideas as they come out, everyone can see this live and sort of like comment on it. So it does actually work fairly similar. And I think the one thing I think that people do lose, and the one thing that I've always been concerned about, and partly goes back to my comment about diversity, is that one of the problems of the pandemic one of the problems of remote working isn't the fact that it's remote working, is that often it's remote working whilst being restricted. That you're in a real bubble now. You often can't go outside, you can't see what's happening, and everyone else is feeling that, so maybe that's okay. But I think it's far too easy to restrict your thinking, to restrict your exposure. And that brings obviously a lot of stress, but it's not good, not good for creativity. So, having very free form conversations, having social conversations that has nothing to do with work, online, making sure that these sessions are actually quite a lot of fun, that people want to get engaged, is very important to helping this process. And I just think that you just need to pay a lot more attention to those which normally have come naturally.
I remember visiting you at Dynamo, and it's a lovely, fun, warm environment that you'd made with stuff to play with all over the place. And play was quite an important part of your process. I guess if you're stuck in a bedroom, it's going to be a bit more difficult to have the same kind of state of mind that you might have in a brainstorm if you're in one of your brainstorms. So what would you recommend somebody does to kind of get themselves in the right state of mind while remote working?
Well, often people do have things to play with at home. But I think, some of it, if you want to have a creative brainstorm, for instance, about a client, the best way to start to think about it is firstly to immerse yourself a little bit in what the client's doing and what they want to achieve, and that you just get that from reading, right? Having a very clear setup in a particular brainstorm and coming up with ideas, and breaking it up a little bit, like having different types of brainstorms, having different types of conversations, having someone like control different sections of it. None of this is rocket science. I think there's lots of guides out there on how to run brainstorms. But what I have seen is that is far too, the most important thing is not to be negative in a brainstorm. Is not to say, oh well, we're not going to do that, or the client won't do that, or that's just not possible, because that's not the point. A brainstorm is like blue sky thinking. It's like trying to come up with ideas. My point will be though that that's almost the smallest part of being effective. And I think the biggest part of being effective is trying to work out how to do it, how to sell it, how to get people to approve it, how to budget for it, how to tweak it to make it better. And that comes from, I think, tension. People, like a number of people working on it quite closely in a quite short time frame to come up with the answer. So I'll give you a really good example. We a while ago we pitched a phone manufacturer that they should make a gold phone. This, having my background in mobile phones, pitching a hardware manufacturer to do something different with their hardware is always a very high risk strategy. But in that year, we saw Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. We had this idea that gold was going to be quite big, from the the golden ticket, and also the company, which was HTC, sponsored the Mobile Awards as well. So we thought there was lots of really interesting affinity there. But it's something that we wanted to do for a while, and it's just that we found the right client. We walked in, we did the pitch, they loved it. We walked out of the pitch, we knew we'd won the account. But there's some really interesting things that happened in the execution. So, for instance, we had this guy who said he could make gold out of anything, but he turned out to be somewhat of an imposter. And when we tried to contact him to do it, he just disappeared. And it was only then when we started thinking about his website, like gold-plated yachts, we're like, yeah, well, maybe actually that was a bit too much. So we then had to find someone else, a company called Gold Genie to do it. But the magic came from a few small things that we did with this. Firstly, Samsung and Apple released gold-coloured phones that year whilst we were working on the project, which was fantastic because they had gold-coloured phones and we were going to do a gold phone. Now, gold phones had been done before, but again, it's how you do it that matters. But the magic came from us suddenly thinking, well, let's put it in a bomb-proof case. Right, make a case for it that's so valuable. Let's also hire a security guard with white gloves to walk around with the case, so no journalist can get near it unless there's a security guard. And what ended happening is the coverage tended to be about not just the gold phone, but the case and the security guard that was covering it, because it was a bit of theatre, right? And that, we had the idea for the gold phone, but it's only when we were thinking about the execution, where we had to find a different gold supplier and how we would present it, that all of these ideas, came up. And the result of that was incredible. We changed brand preference for HTC. They then spent $1 million on above the line advertising in New York to replicate the campaign. They started actually making gold plated phones for some regions as well. And to have a simple idea from a PR agency that changes the way a manufacturer thinks about their product was, for me, quite incredible. And that it really came from the varied execution that we did as we rolled it out.
So what would you say are the secrets or the rules of trying to persuade a client to go with a creative idea?
So I think this is always the tough one, right? Because I think sometimes you can walk in there with a deck that shows a few cats being quite cute, and the client will go, "That's fantastic, let's do that." And other clients will go, "Well, what's the ROI on it? I need to see sort of detailed projections in terms of sales to my websites, visits and traffic." And so there's no single answer in terms of addressing the client. I think what you need to set aside the creative idea for the moment and think about the client and think about how they understand things and think about the different ways in which to present to them. Because for some clients, a couple of slides will do. For another client, you have to do an entire project plan with like costings and budget. So that's good client communications and client management. I think, though, with most of them, you need a hook. You need to lead up to the story. You need to give some context to what you're doing. You need to tell them a story. And PR people are good at this. We're quite good at storytelling. So if you think about that as a deck and you think about the pacing of what you're going to show them, it doesn't have to be much. But like as a build-up for context to get them excited is fine. We did one recently with a pitch that we won for a client. And the CEO at the end of it said that he was shaking. He'd never seen a presentation like this before. And what we did is we had 3 ideas, and the first idea was okay. The second idea was pretty good. And the third idea, I think was like a standout idea. But he loved the first idea straight away. And so what happened was the next idea, he got somewhat overexcited. And, it was one of those dream pitches where, at the end of it, again, you just know that, that you've won. Now, how we came up with those ideas, again, was... it was 3 or 4 of us thinking about the client, thinking about what mattered at this particular time. So the ideas were very timely and relevant, but also ideas that could be built on. And I think that's the other thing to think about, is that often people think about work as like one-off piece. And that's great. There's quite a lot of investment for that one-off piece. If, however, you can take the one-off piece and you can replicate it and evolve it and do it again in a slightly different way, or do it every year or every 3 months, I think that becomes really, really, interesting. And for any sort of CEO looking at that, seeing an idea that could be used in different ways, I think has great attractions. I mean, one thing you have to remember is that half my life has been in-house and half my life has been out-of-house, right? So when I've been in-house, I've worked with some amazing creative directors, art directors, advertising agencies, media companies, PR companies, and so I've learned an awful lot from some incredible people along the way. So a lot of my thinking has been it's just copying the best of them, really.
What are the tools that you've started to use with your team to kind of come up with these shake-inducing pitches? So, I mean, consumer tech clients, it's all about images, really. So it's all about having good images presented to them within a nicely presented deck that matters. A bit of time taken over everything. Going back to AQA, so any question answered, the idea is that you send a text and you get a text answer, and we were limited to 140 characters initially, which was the length of an SMS message plus a little bit for our branding. And
what the way we judged our workers was on we called SPG, which is spelling, punctuation, and grammar. So we were always looking at the very minute details, and if anyone did typos and carried on doing typos, that we let them go. And I think that attention to detail has sort of carried over now in almost all the work that we do, so that any piece of work that's client ready should look good, and it should look as if you spent a bit of time over it. I know we're incredibly busy all the time. We've got so many things to do, but it doesn't take much to do a first draft, put it to bed, wake up in the morning, and just review it again and just fix it a little bit, so that the spacing, the fonts are all similar. It looks either looks at your brand or the client's brand. We veered between those two sometimes. And attention to detail throughout, I think, is like really, really important, because if you show that you care about the small things, you're going to care about the big things. And I think that's one of the things that clients really like.
And behind the scenes, what kind of things are you using? You mentioned that you can recreate whiteboards online. What kind of things have you picked up that you really love?
A while ago, we moved quite quickly away from PowerPoint to Google Slides because it was so collaborative. I think any piece of software that is collaborative works really well, and actually Google has within it the ability to do whiteboards and things like that. So we've done that. The other thing that we found was quite interesting, which is it's kind of like a secret weapon that I'm going to reveal. When you're pitching to clients and you have 7 PR agencies in the room, they're all going to be pretty similar, to be fair, right? Pick 7 consumer tech agencies that are doing quite well. They all have fairly good, people working for them. I've come out of pitches where the clients told me, everyone's had quite, similar ideas. So you really got to think about ways to stand out. So one of the things that we did is we used slightly different software to everyone else. We used a conferencing software called Toucan, which was set up by a couple of 20-year-olds in Stanford University. And instead of going into a normal Zoom or Hangouts or Microsoft Teams, you're presented with these bubbles of people wandering around, and it has the same capabilities. And the immediate first impression that the potential client had of you is, they do things slightly differently. And any point of difference, as long as it's a positive point of difference, really works for you. And we've had really good success with startups. And we did a launch project for Toucan, which is why we knew their software. But it's worked like extremely well for us, because you go into the pitch with people going, I like this. This is quite different. And you're already changing their state of mind to being much more receptive to what you're going to bring to them.
So you're storytelling in a pitch and trying to do something really quite different. How risky is it that you're going to go in with something that's just going to turn people off?
You want to work, I think, with clients that will embrace your ideas. And if they don't embrace your ideas and they don't like the way that you presented things, they're going to turn you down, which I don't think is a bad thing. There's so much more on a pitch about, preparation, spending time with the client before you even pitch, communication, research, data points. It's not just about, creativity. Sometimes, for instance, what you can do is you can have an "and finally," it's almost like a throwaway idea for like a very big idea. But clients always want ideas.
Are you worried about people stealing those ideas? That's the other risk that people worry about.
Yeah, I know, and it's a real problem, I think. And we've had it. We had a pitch. I'm not going to name the company. We had a pitch where we had a kick-ass presentation, really good ideas. And actually, a week after, their procurement team contacted us and asked us for the details, saying, "Congratulations, you won." And which we were really excited about. It's a well-known consumer tech brand. And then the people we pitched to emailed us a couple of hours later saying, "I'm really sorry, our procurement team got the wrong company." So for 1 hour, we thought we'd won. And I think that was indicative of what happened next, because our ideas that were presented to the company, we presented 3 ideas, and 2 of the ideas came out by the company 6 months on, blatantly, similar. However, I am, my view on this is I do think that many people will have similar ideas. I think there is a creative process of like sharing ideas. I don't think the idea is everything, right? I think the execution is super important as well. So people might take away the idea, but they're never going to take away the execution. And I think you're in this business, when you're in this business for a long time, and you're sharing ideas, if you keep coming up with good ideas, and some people might steal them, but if you keep coming up with good ideas, other people are going to hire you and do them. So I take a longer term view, and I'm not particularly worried about that, because mostly because of the execution.
And when you have a retained client, do you feel that it's the agency's responsibility to proactively come up with ideas?
Yeah, if you want to keep the client.
So you shouldn't wait for the client to ask you?
No, you should never wait for the client for anything. I mean, the client, one of my clients, the most number of agencies I had working for me was about 7 agencies working for me at one time, so globally. And I had many more responsibilities apart from doing PR. I was running sort of global marketing. And so what you want as someone who's time poor is for these agencies to come up with really timely ideas, sometimes small ideas, sometimes big ideas. And what it shows you is that they're thinking about you all the time. They're not just reacting, to what you tell them. And that's good. In any relationship, right? If it's just one way, it's only going to go so far. You need a bit of give and take. You need someone else to suggest something. Let's do this. Should we do this? And sometimes they can, I think it's important. Sometimes they can be like small ideas, and sometimes they can be much bigger ideas. And I think if you keep, sometimes it's about, issue jumping. We've seen this in the press. This thing's happening. There's this day that's happening. We could do something around it. And other times it could be, much bigger ideas. So in order to get that, I think within the agency, then you need to have a process to be able to do that. Process and creativity create tension. Creativity is about being unfettered. It's about freedom. It's about trying to think differently, to go left when everyone's going right. Process is about sort of nailing this down. When are you going to do this? How are you going to deliver? What shape is it going to do? What format? How are you going to present it? I think they're both super important, and it's where you get this conflict, it's where you get this tension that the greatest things come out. You can have a very light process. Each month what we want to do is set some time aside to try and think of, something different for the client. So maybe in our weekly meeting, we go, what's happening at the moment? What could we suggest? What could we do? Something that's slightly different. And that, that works extremely well. And sometimes those ideas, come to you in very, strange times. I'm a big fan of having something to take notes beside your bed. For instance, I had this idea for a client where I woke up on a Saturday morning and had this really good idea, for a client. And I noted it down, but I actually noted it down in the form of an email just to send to the client, to send to the CEO. And he responded 5 minutes later saying, "This is brilliant, let's do it." It's some of that thing is that comes from just thinking about the work and thinking about the client. I'm not recommending that people think about their clients and their work all of the time, but it's good to put aside some time for it every week.
You can find out more about Paul and his work by following him on Twitter @PCockerton, and have a look at clarity.pr. If you want to find out more about who's coming up on the podcast and put some questions to them, have a look at henschelcenter.com/podcast.